The 110-pound combat dog had not eaten in 7 days. He had broken 3 handlers' fingers, torn through 2 reinforced kennel latches, and lunged at every person who came within 4 feet of his door. The veterinary staff at Calloway Medical Center had already drawn up the paperwork. The military liaison had signed off. The date was set. In 48 hours, one of the most decorated special operations K-9s in the history of the Phantom Fang program would be euthanized, not because he was sick, not because he had failed, but because the people holding his file had decided he was no longer worth saving. Nobody asked the dog what he was waiting for. If this story moves you, if it makes you angry, if it makes you feel something real, subscribe to my channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The drive into Fenwick, Colorado on a January morning was the kind of experience that made a person feel small in the best possible way. The mountains didn't care who you were. The cold didn't negotiate. Elara Voss had always liked that about high-altitude country. The landscape had no opinion of her, no memory of what she used to be, and no interest in what she'd lost. She drove a 7-year-old Subaru with a cracked rear bumper and a heating system that worked about 60% of the time. The other 40% she wore a fleece under her scrubs and pretended she wasn't freezing. Her duffel bag sat in the back seat with 3 days of clothes and a paperback she'd been trying to finish for 6 months. Temporary assignments didn't require much packing. You learn that fast. Calloway Medical Center appeared on the right side of Route 9, like it had been dropped there from a different era, a sprawling complex of glass and concrete that had been expanded 3 times in the last 15 years and still managed to look perpetually under construction. The main building was 8 stories. The East Wing, added in 2019, housed a specialized rehabilitation unit that, according to the staffing agency, was the reason they needed extra nursing personnel in January. Post-holiday surge, staff burnout, the usual. Elara had heard that explanation before. Almost never the whole story. She checked in at the administrative desk, got her badge printed, and was handed off to the nursing supervisor on the 3rd floor, a compact woman in her late 50s named Joellen Pruitt, who moved like someone who'd been running short-staffed for so long that efficiency had become a survival mechanism rather than a personality trait. "Travel nurse?" Pruitt asked without looking up from her tablet. "Yes, ma'am, Elara Voss. Agency sent my paperwork ahead." "See it." Pruitt finally looked at her. The assessment lasted approximately 2 seconds. Trauma background 8 years. 4 of those in surgical step-down. Any experience with behavioral cases? Patients who've been through serious psychological events? Question landed differently than it was probably intended. Elara kept her expression level. Some. Pruitt made a small sound that wasn't quite approval. "We'll put you on the 3rd floor general rotation for now. You'll be working with Darren Cole. He's your charge nurse. He'll orient you. Don't try to learn everything on the first day. You won't, and you'll exhaust yourself trying." "Understood." Lunch break is staggered. Cafeteria's on the 2nd floor, but the line moves slow, so most people bring food from home. She handed Elara a color-coded floor map. "Any questions?" 1. Elara folded the map in half. "I heard on the way in that there's a K-9 unit being housed somewhere on the property. Military dog?" Pruitt's expression shifted in a way that was hard to name, not irritation, not quite discomfort. Something between the two. "That's not a 3rd floor matter. I wasn't suggesting it was. Just heard it mentioned. Wherever you heard it, I'd let it go." Pruitt's tone wasn't unkind, but it was definitive. "We have enough to manage on this floor without borrowing trouble from somewhere else. Darren's at the station. Go introduce yourself." Elara went. Darren Cole was 32, originally from Pueblo, and had been a charge nurse at Calloway for 4 years, long enough to know where every supply closet was, and short enough to still be mildly bothered by things that the more seasoned staff had stopped seeing entirely. He shook Elara's hand with the energy of someone who genuinely liked his job on most days, gave her a 10-minute tour that was actually useful, and then apologized in advance for the call schedule. "January's always rough," he said, leading her past a row of patient rooms. "We lose people to flu, kids in school sports injuries pick up, and the ICU usually has 2 or 3 cases that spill over into our floor because they don't have beds. You'll hit the ground running." "That's fine. Where were you before this?" "Raleigh, before that Fort Bragg area." He glanced at her. "Military base?" "Adjacent. Mostly civilian population, but the hospital had a DoD contract." She said it the way she says things about that period of her life, factually, briefly, with no opening for follow-up. Darren seemed to sense the boundary without being told. He moved on. "We've got 19 patients on the floor today. I'll walk you through the active charts." Mrs. Albright in 314 is going to ask you to adjust her pillow 6 times a shift. Just do it. She doesn't mean anything by it. Mr. Ferris in 308 will try to tell you he doesn't need his blood pressure medication. He does. And 311 is a pediatric transfer. 7-year-old post-appendectomy. Parents are stressed. Kid is handling it better than they are. Got it. You carry your own IV kit? Always. He nodded like that answered something. Good. We run lean on supplies before restocking Thursday. You figure out how to work with what's there and you'll be fine. By noon, Elara had completed her first medication pass, changed 2 dressings, talked Mr. Ferris back onto his blood pressure medication with a patience that was part genuine and part practiced, and endured 3 pillow adjustments for Mrs. Albright. She ate a granola bar standing at the nursing station, reviewed charts, and tried not to think of the conversation she'd overheard in the parking lot that morning between 2 staff members from the East Wing. They're going to put him down by Wednesday. Nobody can even get close. 3 handlers tried. Whole situation is a mess. They shouldn't have brought him here in the first place. She hadn't meant to listen. She'd been getting her bag out of the car and they were 20 feet away, not bothering to lower their voices. The words had caught somewhere behind her sternum and hadn't let go. Put him down by Wednesday. She'd let it sit through the morning, the way she let most things sit, assessing without acting, gathering information before spending herself. It was a discipline she'd learned the hard way. Reaction without information was how good intentions became bad outcomes. By her afternoon break, she had a name, Dax. She got it from an orderly who delivered supplies between wings and who had apparently decided that the new travel nurse was safe to talk to because she hadn't told him to stop talking. His name was Marcus. He was 24, and he had the gift of casual disclosure that came from having no investment in the politics of the institution. The dog's been there almost 3 weeks, Marcus told her, leaning against the supply cart in the hallway. Military brought him in after his handler died overseas. Some special unit. The idea was that the hospital's vet facility would evaluate him, and then he'd be transferred to a trainer, but he shook his head. He went after the first trainer hard, like knocked the guy into the wall. After that, nobody's been able to do anything with him. Now they're saying he's too dangerous to transfer and too dangerous to keep. Who made that determination? Administration, I think, and some military rep. There's a vet on staff, Doctor. Klein, she's been handling his care, but she's not a behavioral specialist. She's been pushing for more time, but the director overruled her. Who's the director? Grayson Merritt. Marcus said the name. The way people said the names of weather systems neutrally, but with the implication that the weather was often unpleasant. He runs a tight ship. Doesn't like situations that generate liability. A military K-9 attacking staff is exactly the kind of thing that makes him very unhappy. Where is the dog being housed? Marcus gave her a look. East Wing. Sub-level 1. But hey, I'm just saying this because you seem nice. You don't want to go poking around down there. Merritt's already restricted access. Only authorized veterinary and military personnel. I'm authorized veterinary support, Elara said. My nursing license covers animal-assisted therapy environments. It's on my credential sheet. That wasn't why she was considering going. But it was technically accurate, and it gave Marcus something to work with that didn't put him in an uncomfortable position. Stared at her for a moment. I'm going to pretend I don't know what you're going to do. Smart, she said, and pushed off the wall. She didn't go immediately. That would have been sloppy. She finished her shift, documented everything properly, and changed out of her scrubs in the locker room. Then she walked the East Wing corridor at 6:15, when the administrative staff had largely gone home and the overnight clinical crew was in the middle of handoff. It was the natural gap. Every hospital had one. The sublevel was accessed by a stairwell that smelled like concrete and industrial cleaner. The door at the bottom had a keypad, but it also had a swipe reader for badge access, and Elara's badge issued that morning, not yet category restricted, opened it on the first try. The room beyond was larger than she expected. It had been set up as a temporary veterinary isolation space, not a permanent facility. There were 2 kennels along the far wall, portable examination equipment stacked to the right, and fluorescent lighting that hummed at a frequency just below comfortable. The air was climate-controlled but had that flat quality of rooms that didn't get enough circulation. Only 1 kennel was occupied. She knew it was Dax before she could see him clearly. The low sustained sound coming from inside the kennel was not a growl, it was something older than that. Something that didn't have a clean word in English. Not aggression. Not fear. It was the sound of an animal holding itself together through sheer will when everything around it had stopped making sense. Stopped 8 feet from the kennel. She didn't crouch. She didn't make a sound. She didn't reach toward him, or try to speak in the soft, performative tone that people used with animals when they wanted to seem calming, but were actually just projecting their own discomfort. She stood still and let him assess her. He was enormous, a Belgian Malinois cross, coal dark with tawny markings across his chest, with the kind of muscle structure that came from years of genuine work rather than maintenance conditioning. His eyes, even in the flat fluorescent light, were startling, clear and dark and exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He watched her. She watched him back. After 90 seconds, she counted, he stopped making the sound. 3 minutes, he lay down. She stayed for 20 more minutes, not moving, not speaking, not trying to accomplish anything. Then she left, walked back up the stairwell, and drove to her temporary apartment 6 blocks from the hospital. She ate leftover soup, finished a chart note she'd been working on mentally since the afternoon, and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, thinking about the sound that dog had been making, and what it meant that nobody in this building seemed to be listening to it. The next morning, she ran into Dr. Klein at the coffee station on the 2nd floor. Vivian Klein was in her mid-40s, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the focused, slightly distracted look of a person carrying 3 simultaneous problems. She was the hospital's veterinary services coordinator, a role that existed primarily because Calloway had an arrangement with the Fenwick County Animal Control Division and occasionally served as an overflow facility for law enforcement animals. She was not a behavioral specialist. She knew this. Clearly bothered her. "You're the new travel nurse," she said, with the tone of someone who had noticed Elara without making it obvious. "Elara Voss, 3rd floor, Vivian Klein." She poured her coffee and didn't move away. "You went downstairs last night." Elara looked at her steadily. The badge access would show that. Yes, it would. Klein wrapped both hands around her mug. Merit's admin team reviews access logs weekly, so you have about 6 days before anyone formal notices. I'm telling you this not to threaten you, but because you should know how much time you're working with. What happens when they notice? Your access gets restricted, and you probably get a written warning. Maybe referred back to your agency. She paused. Merit doesn't like people going around him. What does Merit want to happen to the dog? Klein's jaw tightened slightly. He wants it resolved, his word. He's been in contact with a military liaison, a man named Major Alderton, and they've agreed on a timeline. Evaluation team comes in Thursday. If the dog can't be safely assessed, they sign off on euthanasia by Friday evening. Tuesday, yes, Elara set down her coffee. The dog isn't dangerous. He's in acute grief, and nobody is treating it like a clinical condition. Klein stared at her. "How long were you downstairs?" "About 25 minutes. The last handler was in there for 4 minutes before he had to be pulled out. The last handler came in loud, moved fast, and probably smelled like 4 other animals." Elara picked up her coffee again. The dog read all of that as threat. He wasn't attacking out of aggression. He was defending the only space he had left. There was a long pause. Klein looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite professional and wasn't quite personal. It was the looks of someone deciding how much to trust information that they didn't have the framework to fully evaluate on their own. "Who are you?" Klein asked quietly. "A nurse on the 3rd floor," Elara said, "who would like very much for that dog to still be alive on Saturday." She went back that evening, and the evening after that. Each time, she sat outside the kennel without touching it. No commands, no food offerings, no eye contact held too long. She brought a chair from the examination area and positioned it 7 feet back, slightly to the side, not directly confrontational, not turning away. A position that said, "I am here. I am not a threat. I am not leaving." By the 2nd visit, Dax had stopped standing when she came in. The 3rd, he moved to the front corner of the kennel closest to her and lay with his head on his paws, watching her with those exhausted, clear eyes. She noticed things. He flinched when the ventilation system cycled up a specific sound, a specific frequency, that probably matched something from a different environment. He tracked the door behind her more than he tracked her, which meant he wasn't primarily watching for attack. He was watching to see who else came through. He had scars on his left shoulder that had healed cleanly, which meant he'd had excellent medical care at some point in his career. And he was thin not critically but noticeably in a way that said the refusal to eat was willful rather than physical illness. He was waiting for something. She just didn't know what yet. On Thursday morning, the evaluation team arrived. She heard about it from Marcus at 7:45, 2 military behaviorists and a senior trainer from the K9 program's regional center, flown in specifically for the assessment. They had 2 hours scheduled with Dax. The evaluation would be formal, documented, and binding. She asked Darren to cover her for a break at 9:30 and walked to the East Wing. The evaluation was not going well. She could hear it from the stairwell, not the sounds of aggression, but the clipped, tense voices of professionals trying to manage an outcome that wasn't cooperating. When she reached the bottom and looked through the small, reinforced window in the door, she could see Dax pressed against the back wall of his kennel, every muscle locked, the hackles along his spine raised in a solid ridge. One of the evaluators was trying to read from a protocol sheet. Another was recording. The trainer was attempting a command sequence that Dax was refusing with the quiet, absolute certainty of a dog who had decided this interaction was not legitimate. The trainer reached toward the kennel door. Dax lunged. It was controlled. He didn't throw himself against the bars mindlessly. He moved with precision, mouth wide, making direct contact with the door handle in a way that sent a clear message. Trainer pulled back. Someone swore. The recording device clicked off. Elara pushed through the door. "Excuse me," said the senior evaluator, a man in his 40s with the straight-back posture of someone who had been military and still carried it in his spine. "His name badge," said Kramer. "This area is restricted. I'm clinical nursing support for this wing. Not entirely accurate. Also not entirely false. I need to note for the record that the dog's current stress indicators are being misread as baseline aggression." Kramer looked at her the way men in institutional authority sometimes looked at nurses who spoke without being addressed, not with open hostility, but with the particular kind of dismissal that was its own form of hostility. "This is a behavioral assessment. It's not a nursing matter." "He flinched at the door handle before you reached for it," Elara said. "That means he anticipated the gesture. That's not aggression, that's conditioned defensive response. He's reading intent, not reacting to immediate threat." "Who are you?" "Elara Voss. I've been observing this dog for 3 days." "You've been." Kramer stopped. Looked at Klein, who was standing near the examination equipment, and had the expression of someone watching a small natural disaster unfold with professional detachment. "Dr. Klein, who authorized this nurse to observe the subject?" Klein hesitated for exactly 1 second. "She has documentation in her credentials for animal-assisted care environments. I'll need to pull the specific file." It was not a yes. But it wasn't a no either, and in institutional settings, ambiguity was often enough to buy time. "I'm going to need to ask you to leave," Kramer said to Elara. "This evaluation has to be conducted under controlled conditions." "It's already failed under controlled conditions." She kept her voice level. She wasn't trying to embarrass him. "I'm not suggesting your team is wrong about his behavior. I'm suggesting the behavior is being interpreted incorrectly, and the interpretation is going to have a permanent consequence that I don't think anyone in this room has actually evaluated." There was a silence. Dax was watching her from the back of the kennel. He hadn't moved since she walked in. Kramer noticed that. She could see him notice it. Something behind his professional composure shifted fractionally. "You have documentation for your observations?" he asked. "I'll have a written report on Dr. Klein's desk by 6 tonight." Studied her for another moment. "I'll be filing my own evaluation as well. And I will be speaking with hospital administration about access protocols in this wing." "Appropriate," she said. "I'd expect nothing less." She left. Merritt found her at 11. He was not a large man, but he had the specific presence of someone who had spent 20 years ensuring that rooms oriented toward him when he entered them. He was 56, with silver hair cut close, and the careful wardrobe of an administrator who understood that appearance was a form of communication. He came to the third-floor nursing station while Elara was updating a patient chart, and he didn't bother with any preamble. "Ms. Voss." "Not a question, a placement." She looked up. "Mr. Merritt, you were in the sub-level evaluation this morning. Briefly uninvited. My badge cleared the door." His jaw moved. "Your badge cleared the door because the system hadn't processed your access restrictions yet. That oversight has been corrected." He set a printed form on the counter between them. "This is a formal notice restricting your movement to third-floor clinical areas only. Any deviation will be addressed through your staffing agency and may result in immediate reassignment." She looked at the form. It was real properly formatted, signed, time-stamped. He'd moved fast. "Your dog evaluation team is going to recommend euthanasia," she said. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise, but something adjacent. An awareness that this conversation was not going where he'd expected. "That's a military determination, not a hospital. The military will follow the on-site recommendation. The on-site recommendation is being shaped by an evaluation that misread the dog's behavioral presentation." She picked up the form, looked at it, set it down again. "I can write you 6 pages that document specifically why the assessment this morning was clinically inaccurate. You don't have to do anything with it, but I think you should have it before you sign off on something that can't be undone." stared at her. You are a third-floor travel nurse who has been at this facility for 72 hours. Yes, and you believe you're qualified to overturn a military K-9 behavioral evaluation. I believe I'm qualified to document what I observed. What anyone does with that documentation is their decision. She held his gaze without aggression, without deference. I'm not asking you to trust my word. I'm asking you to let the record be complete before a decision is final. Merritt said nothing for a long moment. The nursing station around them continued its normal ambient noise, a monitor beeping, someone's phone, a cart rolling down the hall. You have until 5 o'clock, he said. If I receive a report by then, I will read it. I am not promising any particular response to it. He picked up the form and smoothed the corner, and the access restriction stands. If you go back to the sub-level, I will have you removed from this facility and referred to the licensing board. Are we clear? Completely, she said. He left. Darren appeared at her elbow approximately 4 seconds later. What was that? A deadline, Elara said, and went back to her chart. She wrote the report during her lunch break and her afternoon break, and the 20 minutes she had between her last patient check and end of shift. 6 pages by the time she finished clinical, structured, precise, the kind of language that was impossible to dismiss as emotional advocacy. She documented the behavioral markers she'd observed over 3 days, categorized them against established protocols for trauma response in working animals, and included a differential assessment of Dax's presentation versus the indicators of genuine aggression disorder. She did not write it like a nurse making a plea. She wrote it like someone who had done this before, in contexts that Merritt and Kramer and the whole administration of Calloway Medical Center had no visibility into. She sent it to Klein at 4:47 and copied Merritt directly. Then she sat in her car in the parking lot and waited to see what would happen next. What happened next was her phone buzzing with a message from a number she didn't recognize. No name. The message was 4 words: they found your file. Stared at the screen for a long time. The evening had gone completely dark. Parking lot lights threw orange pools across the snow. Somewheres inside the building, in a sub-level room that smelled like concrete and flat recycled air, a combat dog who hadn't eaten in 7 days was lying in the front corner of his kennel watching the door, waiting. Elara Voss sat in her cracked bumper Subaru in the January cold and understood, with a certainty that moved through her like ice water, that her report was only the beginning. Someone had been watching her since she arrived. Someone knew exactly who she was and what she could do. And whoever had sent that message had done so, not as a warning to stop, but as a warning that stopping was no longer an option. Type back, who is this? The response came in 11 seconds. Someone who needs you to keep going. She sat with the phone in her lap for another 2 minutes, the screen dimming and then going dark, and made herself breathe slowly through the cold that was building in the car. Someone who needs you to keep going. That wasn't a threat. She'd received threats before, and they had a different texture, compact, directional, designed to close something down. This message was the opposite. It wanted her moving forward. It wanted her in that building, in that sublevel, doing exactly what she'd already started doing, which meant whoever had sent it either knew her well enough to understand how she operated, or they'd read her file carefully enough to predict it. Either possibility was uncomfortable. She turned the car on, let the heat struggle to life, and drove back to her apartment without responding again. She didn't sleep well, which was not unusual. She made coffee at 5:15, sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, and spent an hour pulling every publicly available document she could find on the Phantom Fang program. Most of it was either redacted or vague to the point of uselessness, congressional budget references, a 2-year-old DoD press release about K-9 deployment efficacy, a brief mention in a defense industry journal about multi-phase handler integration protocols. The program existed. It was real. And it was significant enough that someone had gone to the trouble of burying its operational details under several layers of institutional language. She closed the laptop when the light outside shifted from black to gray. The report was filed. The access restriction was real. Merritt had given her a narrow window and she'd used it, and now the next move wasn't hers to make, it was his, or Kramer's, or whoever the mysterious sender turned out to be. The rational thing was to go to work, do her job on the 3rd floor, and wait for the outcome. She had never been especially good at the rational thing when something was wrong in front of her. 6:45, she called the number back. It rang 4 times before a man answered. His voice was careful in the way of someone who chose every word before saying it, not hesitant, but deliberate. I wasn't sure you'd call. Who are you? A beat. Major Dennis Alderton, military liaison, Phantom Fang program. The name clicked immediately. Alderton was the liaison Marcus had mentioned. the one coordinating with Merritt on the timeline. She'd assumed he was part of the problem. The text message rearranged that assumption, though not entirely. "You sent me a message last night, telling me they found my file," she said. "What file?" "Your service record." Another pause, and this one had something in it, not guilt, but something close to professional embarrassment. "We ran a check on everyone who'd accessed the sublevel this week. Standard protocol. When your name came back, I pulled the full record. The one that isn't in your personnel file here." She said nothing. "Ms. Voss," his voice shifted slightly. Or should I say Specialist Voss, formerly of the Army Veterinary Corps, Fort Langdon Research Division. "You were the lead developer on the Phantom Fang behavioral integration protocols from 2013 to 2017. Kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street. She counted the seconds between its headlights crossing the window and the sound of it disappearing. "Records was sealed," she finally said. It was. "Process error. The seal was incomplete. When the system ran your badge access against the restricted zone flag, it pulled everything." He paused again. "I'm the only one who saw it. I flagged it and closed the query before it could propagate to the administrative log." She let that sit. "Why?" "'Cause," Alderton said, and for the first time his voice lost some of its careful quality and sounded like a man who was tired and was running out of other options. "I have been trying to stop this euthanasia order for 2 weeks. My hands are tied on the military side because the evaluation team has authority. I can't override without a counter-recommendation from a qualified subject matter expert. And the only person in this building who is actually qualified to make that counter-recommendation just spent 3 days sitting outside a dog's kennel and wrote a 6-page clinical report that is more accurate than anything I've seen from the evaluation team." Quiet for a moment. "My credentials in that area are sealed." "I know. I can't disclose them without authorization from the program." "I know that too," he exhaled. "I'm not asking you to disclose them. I'm asking you to stay. Don't let them push you out. Whatever Merritt threatened, whatever the evaluation team does, stay in this building and keep going. That's all I'm asking. The euthanasia order is still on the table." "It is. The evaluation team files their report today. If it recommends termination, Merritt signs off and it goes forward within 24 hours. She looked at the wall above the kitchen table, blank white, the same generic beige white of every temporary apartment she'd ever lived in. "Alderton, what was in my service record that made you call me instead of flagging me to administration?" A long pause. "The part where it said you were the one who designed the specific distress protocols that Dax was trained under. Recovery sequences. The handler bond indicators." His voice was even. "Part where it said that if a Phantom Fang dog ever lost his handler under traumatic circumstances, you were the person most qualified in the country to assess whether he could be rehabilitated." Coffee in front of her had gone cold. "I'll stay," she said. She hung up. The evaluation team's report arrived at Merritt's office at 10:45 that morning. Elara knew this because Klein texted her a single line that said only, "Report submitted. Recommendation as expected." She was changing a wound dressing on Mr. Ferris in 308 when the text came through, and she finished the dressing, documented it, checked his vitals, and had a 2-minute conversation with him about whether he preferred the window blind, open, or closed before she stepped into the hallway and let herself process what that meant. 24 hours. Maybe less. She found Klein in the veterinary supply room at noon, both of them technically somewhere they could have legitimate reasons to be. The door opened to avoid the appearance of a private meeting. "How bad is the report?" Elara asked. Klein pulled a supply inventory sheet off the shelf and pretended to review it. "It calls him a Class IV behavioral risk, recommends immediate termination citing handler injury history, and failed evaluation response. They documented the lunge from yesterday as an unprovoked attack." "It wasn't unprovoked. I know that. The report doesn't." Klein's voice was flat in the way of someone who had been arguing into a wall for long enough that the flatness was a protective measure, not indifference. Merritt received it, signed the acknowledgement within an hour. He's referring to Major Alderton for military concurrence. If Alderton concurs, the order goes live. Alderton won't concur. Klein glanced at her. "You've spoken to him this morning." Pause. Klein set the inventory sheet down. "Elara, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly." "All right. Do you have a background in canine behavioral assessment that you haven't disclosed on your credentials here?" Supply room hummed faintly from the refrigeration unit against the far wall. Someone walked past in the corridor, footsteps loud on the linoleum, and then gone. "I have a nursing license in good standing," Elara said carefully. "I have 8 years of clinical experience." And I have personal knowledge of Phantom Fang program protocols that I'm not at liberty to disclose the source of at this time. Klein studied her for a long moment. She was a smart woman. She understood what that answer did and did not say. All right, she said quietly. What do you need from me? I need access to Dex's original intake records. The military transfer file, not the hospital's version, the original program file that should have come with him when he was transported. Every Phantom Fang dog has a mandatory recovery protocol document that travels with them. That document exists, and if it shows that the required post-handler loss recovery period wasn't followed, then the euthanasia order isn't just wrong, it's a procedural violation of the military's own protocols. Klein was very still. If that document exists here, it would be in the military liaison office files. Alderton's jurisdiction, yes. You'd need Alderton to provide it, yes. Klein picked up the inventory sheet again. Not because she needed it, but because her hands needed something to do. This is either very smart or very dangerous. Usually both, Elara said, and left the supply room. Alderton sent her the file at 2:17. Came as a secure attachment to an email routed through the hospital's internal system, flagged as standard administrative correspondence, so it wouldn't generate an alert. The document was 43 pages. She read it in the break room during a gap between patients, her phone flat on the table, tilted so nobody walking past could see the screen. The Phantom Fang mandatory recovery protocol was explicit. K9 who lost their primary handler to combat death or critical injury was required to undergo a minimum of 30 days of structured de-escalation before any behavioral evaluation could be conducted. 30 days had to include daily contact with a qualified handler bond specialist, a specific nutritional monitoring schedule, and documented environmental stability assessments. Dax had been at Calloway Medical Center for 19 days. Not 30, 19. The evaluation team had conducted their assessment on day 19. The euthanasia was being ordered on day 20. Every step of the process had been compressed by 11 days, and the compression was documented. She could see it in the intake paperwork, the handoff notes, scheduling requests that had been submitted by the hospital's administration rather than by the military liaison. Someone had pushed the timeline, not carelessly, not through oversight. The intake paperwork had been processed with a deliberate acceleration. Someone had flagged Dax's case as a priority clearance, which had bypassed the standard 30-day hold and moved straight to evaluation scheduling. The flag had been submitted by a member of the hospital administrative staff. Scrolled to the name. It wasn't Merritt. The name on the flag was Brenna Solano, Administrative Coordinator, East Wing. Elara sat with that for a moment. She didn't know Solano, had never seen her name in any context related to this situation, which meant either Solano had acted independently with a motive Elara couldn't yet trace, or Solano was the visible end of something that extended further back and further in than she'd understood. She forwarded the relevant pages to Alderton with a single line. Who is Brenna Solano, and why does she have authority to flag a priority clearance on a military K9 intake? His response came back. In 6 minutes, I'm finding out. Stay where you are. Staying where she was turned out to be harder than expected, because at 3:40 Merritt appeared on the 3rd floor again. He didn't come to the nursing station this time. He came to the break room where she was finishing her chart work before evening handoff, and he brought someone with him. A woman's, the kind of composed, watchful demeanor that didn't belong in a hospital setting, too still, too unreadable. The stillness of someone professionally trained to reveal nothing. Ms. Voss. Merritt's voice had changed since yesterday. It had gone from controlled irritation to something colder and less improvised. He'd been briefed on something. This is Ms. Patricia Hale from Donner Group. They hold the medical services contract for the Phantom Fang program support facilities. Elara looked at Hale. Hale looked back with the same polite blankness. She's requested an opportunity to speak with you, Merritt said. About what? Hale answered before Merritt could. About your involvement in the Dax situation and some concerns we have about the information you've been circulating. Her voice was smooth and precise, the kind that had probably been trained. We understand you filed a clinical report with Dr. Klein and Director Merritt yesterday. We'd like to discuss the basis for that report. The basis is 3 days of direct observation documented in clinical notation, Elara said. It's all in the report. Yes. Hale tilted her head slightly. We're interested specifically in how you framed the behavioral indicators. The language you used is quite technical, specific. It echoes protocols that are restricted to certain program personnel. The room was small and getting smaller. Elara set down her pen. I used established veterinary behavioral terminology, she said, publicly available in the scientific literature. Some of it is. Hale smiled not warmly. Some of it isn't. The implication hung there. Merritt was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read, not quite satisfaction, not quite discomfort. Something that suggested he was less in control of this conversation than he was presenting. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting," Elara said. "I'm suggesting that your report uses language consistent with classified Phantom Fang behavioral documentation, and we'd like to know how you came to be familiar with that documentation." Hale paused. "If you have undisclosed credentials related to the program, that creates some questions about your presence at this facility and your motives for becoming involved in this case." Clean move. She could see the architecture of it, not an accusation, but a frame. If Elara denied the knowledge, they could contradict her. If she admitted the knowledge, they had grounds to question her clearance and her presence. Either way, the focus shifted from the euthanasia order to her. "Think," Elara said, keeping her voice level, "that if Donner Group has questions about my credentials, the appropriate channel is through my staffing agency and the hospital's HR department. This is not the appropriate setting for that conversation. We're just trying to," and I think, she continued, as if Hale hadn't spoken, "that a private contractor showing up in a break room to question a nurse about a clinical report she filed through proper channels is itself a fairly interesting thing to document." She picked up her pen. "I'll be noting this interaction in my incident log. If Donner Group or Director Merritt would like to pursue this formally, I'm happy to participate in a formal process." Hale's expression didn't crack, but it didn't need to. Stillness shifted slightly, something recalculating. Merritt put his hand on the doorframe. "We'll be in touch," he said. They left. Elara sat alone in the break room for 30 seconds. Then she pulled out her phone and texted Alderton. "Donner Group just sent someone to question me in person. Patricia Hale. How connected is Donner to the Phantom Fang contract?" She was back at the nursing station before his response came through. When it did, it was longer than his previous messages. She read it twice. "Donner Group holds the logistics and facilities contract for Phantom Fang program support. They are currently under review by the Inspector General's office for billing irregularities. Program is discredited if a flagship canine like Dax is ruled behaviorally unfit. It supports a narrative that the program is failing and the contract should be renegotiated. I have been trying to report this conflict of interest up the chain for 6 days. Nobody is moving fast enough. You need to go back downstairs tonight, not to observe, to do the actual assessment before they execute the order tomorrow." She read that last sentence again. Tomorrow. The timeline had moved. The 24 hours she'd been given was already shorter than she'd thought. She finished her shift. She documented everything correctly. Talked to Mrs. Albright about her pillow. Listened to Mr. Ferris complain about his dinner. And checked on the 7-year-old in 311, whose parents had finally started to relax a little, and who had, apparently, charmed most of the nursing staff into smuggling him an extra pudding cup. She drove past her apartment and kept going. She parked 3 blocks from the hospital, in a lot that didn't have cameras covering the east entrance. She'd checked the camera positions on her second day, a habit she'd never quite managed to drop. She went in through a side door that used a physical key rather than a badge, which she'd gotten from Klein that afternoon, under the explanation that she needed access to the supply room for a patient equipment request. Klein had handed it over without asking the follow-up question that would have made both of them uncomfortable. The sublevel was dim when she reached the bottom of the stairwell. The lights were on their overnight setting, lower, yellower, more disorienting. She moved through the outer room and into the kennel area and stopped. Dax was already awake. He was sitting up, oriented toward the door she'd just come through, ears forward, not in a guard posture, in a waiting posture. There was a difference that most people didn't know to look for, but she'd spent 4 years learning to read every variant. She set down the bag she'd brought, sat in the chair that had been in the same position for 3 days, said nothing. He watched her. She reached into the bag, slowly, visible, deliberate, pulled out a small cloth that she'd kept in her jacket pocket for 2 days, absorbing her ambient scent, the way the protocol specified for reintroduction with a bonded animal in grief. She placed it on the floor in front of the kennel door, within the range of the slot at the bottom, and moved her hand back. He dropped his head and sniffed the air. Then something happened that she had not expected, not because she didn't know it was possible, but because she had not let herself believe it would happen this fast. Here, under these conditions, this inadequate room with its humming lights and its recycled air, this made a sound, low, specific, not a whine and not a growl. It was the sound that the Phantom Fang protocols described as a secondary recognition vocalization. The sound a dog made when something registered as known rather than new. She had heard it described in research documents. She had never heard it directed at her before. stayed completely still. He stood, moved to the kennel door, put his nose to the slot at the bottom, and then, with a deliberateness that made her throat close, he pushed the latch up with his muzzle from the inside. Kennel door swung open. He stood in the opening for 3 seconds, looking at her. She didn't move. She kept her hands visible, her posture neutral, her eyes just to the side of direct contact. He walked out of the kennel and lay down at her feet. She sat with a 110-pound combat dog's head resting against her shoe in a dim sub-level room, and she understood that she had perhaps 4 hours before someone realized what had happened here, and that 4 hours was not enough time for everything she needed to do, and she was going to do it anyway. She reached down slowly and placed her hand on the side of his neck, feeling the muscle and the warmth and the tension releasing in increments like a body, finally deciding it was allowed to rest. "I know," she said quietly. "I know who you're waiting for." Her phone buzzed on the chair beside her. She picked it up without moving her other hand. It was Alderton. 4 lines. She read them once and felt something cold and clarifying settle through her. IG contact confirmed Donner Group has an embedded coordinator at Calloway. Someone on hospital staff has been actively shaping the intake documentation since Dax arrived. The access logs from the military transfer file show edits made after the original submission edits that shortened the mandatory recovery window and altered the behavioral baseline notes. This isn't negligence. Someone built a case for termination from the inside. I need your assessment documented by 600. The IG team lands in Denver at 700. She read it a second time. Dax breathed slowly against her foot. Outside, somewhere above them, the hospital ran its normal overnight rhythm nurses making rounds. Monitors doing their quiet work, the building existing in its particular state of managed crisis that never fully stopped. She looked down at the dog. Then she opened the notes application on her phone and began to type. She typed for 2 hours and 19 minutes without stopping. Not notes a formal behavioral assessment. She structured it the way she'd been trained to structure them, back when structuring them had been her actual job rather than the thing she was, pretending she didn't know how to do. Observable behaviors first, each time-stamped from memory, with the precision of someone who had spent years learning to file experience in real time. Then differential analysis, ruling out aggression disorder, ruling out neurological damage, ruling out handler transfer failure. Then the positive indicators, recognition vocalization, voluntary kennel exit, approach behavior without command, sustained non-defensive contact. Then the section that was going to cause problems. She titled it Protocol Compliance Review and documented, point by point, the specific Phantom Fang mandatory recovery requirements and the specific ways in which Dax's intake process had failed to meet them. Day count. Handler bond specialist contact 0 instances documented. Nutritional monitoring inconsistent with 3-day gaps. Environmental stability assessment not performed. She pulled the dates from the transfer file Alderton had sent and laid them against the protocol requirements like a transparency over a blueprint, letting the gaps speak for themselves. By the time she finished, Dax had shifted position twice, but hadn't moved away from her. He was lying on his side now, which she documented as well. Lateral recumbency in a high-stress environment was a significant behavioral indicator, the kind that didn't happen with an animal in active aggressive crisis. She sent the document to Alderton at 5:48, 12 minutes ahead of his deadline. His response came back in 4 minutes. IG team confirms receipt. They're moving the Denver arrival to 630. Elara, leave the sublevel before the morning staff arrives. If you're found down there, Merritt will have grounds to remove you before this plays out. She looked at Dax. He was asleep. She sat for another few minutes just watching him breathe, which was not a clinical activity, and she knew it. And then she gathered her bag, stood slowly so as not to startle him, and walked to the door. She looked back once. He had lifted his head and was watching her with those clear, exhausted eyes. "I'll be back," she said, which was either a promise or a very optimistic statement of intent, depending on what the next 8 hours looked like. She went back up the stairwell and drove home in the pale pre-dawn gray of a Colorado January and slept for 90 minutes on her couch with her phone on her chest. Did not announce themselves. That was the first thing she noticed when she arrived for her shift at 7:15. The quality of the silence in the administrative corridor on the first floor was different. Not louder or quieter, but denser. The kind of silence that happened when people were being careful about what they said near whom. 2 people she'd never seen before were in the main administrative hallway with visitor badges, and the specific body language of individuals who were not visiting they were assessing. One was on a phone call, speaking quietly toward the wall. The other was reviewing something on a tablet, positioned so she could see both the elevator bank and the stairwell door simultaneously. Elara took the stairs to the third floor and ran her morning medication pass without incident. Alderton texted her at 8:03, IG is in Merritt's office. Merritt doesn't know yet what the scope of the review is. He thinks it's a standard compliance audit. Do not go anywhere near administration today. She texted back, what about the euthanasia order? 3 minutes passed. It's on hold pending review, but that's informal. Nothing's been formally suspended. If Merritt pushes it through before IG can act, it's still valid. She looked at the clock, 8:07. The overnight vet tech who managed Dax's morning check-in would be finishing her shift at 8:30. After that, there was a gap before the next scheduled contact at noon, the same gap that had existed every day, the one that nobody on the clinical side seemed to have flagged as a problem. Texted Klein, can you stall the noon check-in if I need you to? Klein's response was almost immediate, already planning to. Move carefully. The problem arrived at 9:50 in the form of Brenna Solano. Elara had been walking a patient to the rehabilitation gym on the second floor when she saw the name badge, small, laminated, clipped to the breast pocket of a dark blazer. Brenna Solano, East Wing Administrative Coordinator. She was in the hallway outside the elevator, talking to someone on her phone in a low, rapid voice, free hand making small controlled gestures that suggested she was not having an easy conversation. She was younger than Elara had expected, late 30s, maybe early 40s, with a composed surface that was working harder than it looked. When she turned and noticed Elara watching her, something crossed her face brief, quickly managed, and she ended her phone call. Elara kept walking with her patient, but she noted the direction Solano turned when she thought she was unobserved toward the stairwell, toward the east wing, toward the sublevel, got her patient settled in the rehabilitation gym, handed off to the PT, and pulled out her phone. Texted Alderton, Solano is heading toward the sublevel. Now. His response took 40 seconds, which was 40 seconds too long. I can't intercept her without tipping the IG review. Klein downstairs? No, then you're the only one who can slow this down. Do not let her get to that dog alone. The instruction was direct and completely outside, anything Elara was formally authorized to do, and she walked to the stairwell door and went through it anyway. She caught up to Solano at the bottom of the stairwell, just as the woman was swiping her badge at the sublevel door. Miss Solano. She kept her voice even, professional, the tone of someone who encountered colleagues in unexpected places as a matter of routine. Solano turned. The composure was better up close than it had looked from across the hallway, but there were things underneath it that professional composure couldn't fully mask a tension in the jaw, quality to the eyes that was either stress or calculation or both. Can I help you? Elara Voss, third floor nursing. I have a supply retrieval request for Dr. Klein. She asked me to bring it down. This area is restricted. I know. Cleared my badge access through her veterinary services authorization last week, which was technically accurate. Klein's authorization was still active, and Merritt's restriction had been issued verbally, not through the badge system. I won't be long. Solano looked at her. Something shifted in the look, not believing her. Exactly. But calculating the cost of a confrontation here, in a stairwell, on a morning when she had other priorities. I have a scheduled administrative review in there, Solano said. Stay out of your way. Elara held the door and gestured in a way that was an invitation and a claim simultaneously. I'm going through this door. The question is just whether we're making an issue of it. Solano went through. Elara followed. The sublevel had the same flat light, the same humming refrigeration. Dax was already on his feet. She could hear him moving in the kennel before she could see him. When they rounded the equipment stack and came into the kennel area, he was at the front of the kennel, ears forward, tracking both of them. Solano stopped at the sight of him. Not from fear, from something else. A recognition that had a different quality. She was looking at Dax the way someone looked at a problem they'd expected to be resolved by now. Dax was looking at Solano in a way Elara immediately filed, still focused, hackles not fully raised but ears back. Not the defensive posture he'd showed the evaluation team. A different configuration. She'd seen it described in program documentation. It was the threat identification posture, the one trained into special operations dogs when they were being shown a target. Someone at some point had exposed Dax to Solano in a context that had registered as adversarial. The dog remembered her. Elara kept her position between Solano and the kennel, not blocking, just present. What kind of administrative review? She asked. Solano's attention was still partly on Dax. Intake documentation audit. Routine. Interesting timing given the IG team upstairs. The silence that followed that sentence was specific. Solano turned toward her fully, and the composure had shifted from professional to something more guarded. I'm not sure what you mean. I think you probably are. Elara's voice stayed level. Think you're down here because you know the transfer file has been reviewed, and you're trying to understand what's been seen. She paused. I'm not here to confront you. I'm here because that dog is alive, and I'd like him to stay that way, while the people upstairs do their work. Solano said nothing. Dax made the low sound he made when he was processing something, and Solano's eyes went to him and then back to Elara. You don't know what you've gotten into, Solano said. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of what she apparently believed was fact. I know the mandatory recovery window was manipulated, Elara said. I know the behavioral baseline notes were edited after submission. I know Donner Group has a financial interest in the Phantom Fang program's performance record, and I know the IG team has the transfer file. She met Solano's eyes. That's enough to know that anything you came down here to do is already too late. The moment held. Dax had stopped moving. He was watching Solano with the absolute attention of a trained animal in decision mode, waiting for a signal that hadn't come. Solano left. No more words, no argument. She walked back through the equipment area and out the stairwell door, and the sound of her footsteps going up was precise and unhurried in the way of someone managing their presentation, even when they were the only audience. Elara exhaled once quietly and turned back to Dax. He had moved to the kennel door. He pushed the latch up. She was still not entirely used to watching him do it, the precision of it, and walked out and stood next to her. Put her hand on his neck and felt the tension in him, not gone but diminished, the hackles slowly releasing. Yeah, she said. I know. She was back on the third floor by 10:40, in time for a medication pass and a dressing change, and a conversation with the mother of the 7-year-old in 311, who had questions about post-operative activity restrictions that Elara answered carefully and completely and then went to find Darren because she needed 45 minutes without being needed. You look like you've been awake since Tuesday, Darren said. Something like that. The IG people are still in with Merritt. He leaned against the nursing station counter. Whole admin floor's locked down. Nobody's talking about why, but the guesses are getting creative. How creative? Everything from a billing audit to a federal investigation. Ortega from housekeeping said she heard someone say the word contractor twice in a row and decided it was about the renovation project. She's wrong about that, I think. Probably, Elara said. Darren looked at her with the expression he'd been developing for 2 days, not suspicious, but aware. He was perceptive in the way that good charge nurses were perceptive. He noticed patterns without needing to name them. Are you involved in whatever's happening downstairs? She considered her answer. I filed a clinical report yesterday that some people found inconvenient. Is that all? That's the version I can tell you right now. Quiet for a moment. Then, if you need coverage for anything this afternoon, I can shuffle the schedule. She looked at him. He met her eyes with the steady, practical calm of someone who had decided to be useful without requiring an explanation. I might need that, she said. Thank you. Don't thank me. Tell me what time. Alderton called her at 11:23, while she was in the supply corridor with enough ambient noise to make the call look casual if anyone walked past. IG has Merritt's records, he said. He sounded like a man who had not slept and was running on something more caffeinated than was advisable, including the intake modification logs. They found the edits someone used Solano's credentials to make the changes, but the IP address doesn't match her workstation. They're tracing it. Solano was in the sublevel this morning. A sharp pause when, just before 10, I was there. She didn't do anything. She saw that I was there and left. Did she make contact with the dog? No. Elara lowered her voice as someone passed in the main corridor. Alderton, Dax has a trained threat response to her. He recognized her and went into target identification posture. How many times has she been in that room? The silence had a different quality now. SES logs would show that. I'll get them to IG. Fast. If the trail leads back to Donner and Solano as their embedded coordinator, they're going to start managing the exposure. She'll have a legal team within hours if she doesn't already. I know. A pause. The euthanasia order Merritt hasn't formally withdrawn it. IG asked him to hold pending review, but they don't have the authority to compel him until they've formalized the scope of the investigation, which could be another few hours. His signature is still valid, so someone could still move forward with it. Technically, yes. The veterinary tech on duty tonight is the scheduled executor. I don't think she would. You don't know that, Elara said. Kept her voice quiet, but the words had an edge she didn't try to smooth out. She was given an order by her director and a military sign-off. She's going to follow it unless someone tells her explicitly and with authority that it's been suspended. I'm working on getting that authority. Work faster. She ended the call and stood in the supply corridor for a moment, with her hand flat against the wall, feeling the cool of the painted cinder block against her palm, letting it ground her. The afternoon was going to be the critical window. IG would either formalize the suspension by end of business, or they wouldn't. And if they didn't, the order would proceed at 6 o'clock, when the overnight vet tech came on duty. She went back to her patients. At 1:15, Merritt appeared on the third floor for the third time. He was not alone this time. He had two people with him, one of the IG representatives she'd seen in the hallway that morning, and a woman she didn't recognize who carried herself like legal counsel. The IG representative was in his 40s, with a compact, attentive face, and the kind of neutral expression that professionals developed when they needed to observe without influencing. He introduced himself to Elara as Special Agent Rourke, Inspector General's Office, DOD. He did this in the hallway outside the nursing station, in front of Merritt, who had the expression of someone watching something happen that he'd calculated could be managed, and was revising that calculation in real time. "Ms. Voss," Rourke said, "we've reviewed the behavioral assessment you filed early this morning. All right. You documented your assessment methodology in considerable detail. Protocol language you used is consistent with Phantom Fang program documentation that is not publicly available." He wasn't accusatory, just precise. "Can you tell me how you came to be familiar with that framework?" She'd been waiting for this question. She'd been turning it over since Alderton's call the previous morning. There was an answer, and it was going to change the shape of everything that came after, and she had decided somewhere between the supply corridor and this hallway that she was done managing the edges of it. "I developed it," she said. The hallway did one of those things that hallways in hospitals do during significant moments. It kept going. A cart rolled past. A phone rang at the nursing station while the conversation inside it briefly stopped. Merritt stared at her. Rourke's expression didn't change, but his attention sharpened in a way she could feel. "Could you be more specific?" "I'm formerly Army Veterinary Corps, Fort Langdon Research Division, Specialist E5. I was the lead behavioral protocol developer for the Phantom Fang program from 2013 to 2017. The mandatory recovery framework, the handler bond reintegration sequences, the distress differential assessment criteria. I wrote the first version of all of it. Classification seals on my service record were applied when I left the program under a circumstances agreement." She kept her voice even. "The dog in your sublevel was trained under the system I built, and the assessment I filed this morning is the most accurate evaluation of his behavioral state that this facility is going to get, because I am the only person here who designed the criteria he was assessed against." The silence after that had a different texture than the ones before it. More weight, more consequence. Merritt said, "You withheld this information from the hospital. My service record was sealed. I was not in a position to disclose it without authorization from the program. Major Alderton is aware of my background. He identified it through the access log review and made the decision not to refer it to administration, which was his prerogative as the military liaison." She looked at Merritt directly. "What I was in a position to do was observe, document, and file a report through the channels available to me, which I did." Rourke looked at the woman beside him, the one Elara had assumed was legal counsel. The woman nodded once, small, and confirmed. "Ms. Voss," Rourke said, "we're going to need a full formal statement. Today, I'm available. There's also the matter of the euthanasia order currently on file for the subject animal." "Yes." She looked at Merritt. "There is." Merritt's face had gone through several stages since she'd started talking and had landed on something that was no longer controlled. He was a man who managed situations through information advantage, and the rug had just come out, and the landing was not graceful. He stopped, recalibrated. "I want to be clear that the hospital acted on the information available to it. If there was a failure to disclose relevant credentials." Director Merritt. Rourke's voice was not loud, but it had a quality that stopped things. "I'd recommend you speak to your counsel before continuing that line of reasoning. The IG review includes the administrative decisions around this case, and anything you say in this hallway is documentable." Merritt closed his mouth. The woman, who was definitely legal counsel, put her hand on his arm and said something quiet near his ear. Rourke turned back to Elara. "The euthanasia order, can you have your formal assessment in a format suitable for an emergency suspension request within 2 hours? It's already formatted. I can have it to you in 20 minutes. Something moved across Rourke's face, brief, controlled, but real. Not quite surprise and not quite admiration. The recognition of someone who had come in expecting a situation and found it had already been largely managed by a person nobody had considered a factor. 20 minutes, he confirmed. She filed the formal assessment at 1:47. At 12, Rourke issued an emergency hold on the euthanasia order pending IG review, with authority under the DOD Inspector General Act. It was binding. It superseded Merritt's administrative authority on the matter. At 2:38, Merritt's legal counsel informed the administrative staff that the director was unavailable for the remainder of the afternoon. Klein texted her at 2:50, "Orders on hold, I got the notification." "What did you do?" She texted back, "Told the truth," a pause. "Then there's more coming, isn't there?" "Yes, okay." A longer pause. "The IG people asked to review Dax's full intake file. I gave them everything I had, including the access logs from the sublevel, all of them, including Solano's." Elara stopped walking. She was in the stairwell between the second and third floors, and she stood on the landing and looked at the text and understood that Klein had done something that was either going to accelerate the resolution or detonate it prematurely, and there was no way to know which. "Did they say anything?" she typed. "One of them made a phone call immediately. The other asked me if Solano was currently in the building." Pause. "I told them she left at 11. They didn't look surprised." She put her phone in her pocket and went back upstairs. The afternoon moved with the particular urgency of situations that had passed from controllable to inevitable. The administrative floor stayed locked. 2 additional IG staff arrived at 3, and somewhere in the sequence of events that she could only partially see, from the 3rd floor, Donner Group's legal team arrived at the hospital at 4:15 and went directly to the administrative wing. She was doing her final patient rounds at 5:10 when Alderton appeared at the end of the hallway. He was not in civilian clothes. He was in full-service uniform army, with the insignia of a field-grade officer, and he was moving with the specific purposeful stride of someone who had been cleared to do something and was doing it before the clearance could be reconsidered. Stopped next to her at the nursing station. "I need you downstairs. My shift ends at 5:30. "I know. This needs to happen now while IG still has administrative control of the access logs. There's a formal assessment proceeding in 20 minutes. He looked at her directly. "Elara, there are people in that building right now arguing about whether Dax can be rehabilitated or whether the euthanasia order should be reinstated under different grounds. I need someone in that assessment room who can speak to what was observed this morning. The latch, the lateral recumbency, the recognition vocalization." She looked at the clock. She looked at Darren, who was at the station, and had heard enough of that to understand the shape of it. "Go," Darren said. "I've got the floor," she went. The assessment room had been set up in the large examination space adjacent to the kennel area. Someone had brought in a folding table, 2 additional chairs, a recording device. Rourke was there, and the legal counsel woman, and another IG officer she hadn't met. Alderton took a position near the door. Klein was in the corner with a clinical tablet that she was clearly using as both a record and a reason to stay in the room. Dax was not in the kennel. He was sitting in the open floor space between the table and the equipment wall, leashed to a secure anchor point, not aggressively restrained, just bounded, which was standard protocol for an evaluation presence. He was watching the door. When Elara came through it, he stood. Not the target identification posture, not the defensive lock. Stood the way a dog stood when something it had been tracking finally resolved a release of held tension, a reorientation from waiting to present. One of the IG officers said something she didn't catch, because she was focused on Dax, and the fact that he had stopped watching the door and was watching her, and the quality of it was different from anything she'd documented in the assessment notes, and she was going to have to find language for it later. She sat in the chair across from the table. Dax moved as far as the anchor allowed and lay down with his shoulder against her foot. Rourke looked at that for a moment. Then he looked at his notes. Then he looked at the other IG officer. "Let the record reflect," Rourke said, "that the subject animal has demonstrated voluntary approach and sustained contact with the assessment witness without command or inducement." "Reflected," said the other officer and typed something. The formal assessment took 40 minutes. Elara answered every question precisely and without qualification. She did not editorialize. She did not advocate. She presented what she had observed, what it indicated clinically, and what the protocol framework specified. Twice, Rourke asked her to clarify the basis for a conclusion, and twice she walked him through the methodology in enough detail that even someone without a background in behavioral assessment could follow the logic. She was 3/4 of the way through the session when the door to the sublevel opened, and a man she had never seen before came through it. He moved like someone who had been traveling for a long time and was not going to let that be visible. Utility pants, a civilian jacket that sat wrong on a frame that had clearly worn body armor long enough to reshape it. He was maybe 30, with the kind of face that had been through something and hadn't entirely come back from it, not broken, but rearranged. His left arm was carried slightly differently than his right, the careful compensation of a healed injury that hadn't fully resolved. Stopped when he saw Dax. And Dax, the dog who hadn't eaten in 7 days, who had lunged at handlers. who had refused every evaluation, who had been hours from euthanasia, made a sound that Elara had never heard from him before and would not have known how to put in any document. Something between a cry and a bark and pure unreasonable relief. He hit the end of the anchor lead with his full weight, not in aggression, not in distress, in the absolute certainty of an animal who had just found the thing it had been waiting for all along. The man dropped to his knees on the concrete floor, and Dax reached him, and that was the end of the room, the end of the assessment, the end of the formal proceeding, because some things did not wait for process. Elara looked at Alderton. He was already looking at her. "Sergeant Marcus Delray," he said quietly. "Dax's original handler. Reported KIA in the field 7 weeks ago." She looked at the man on the floor with his face buried in the dog's neck, and the dog pressed against him with the totality of everything he had been holding, and said, "Reported." The report was wrong. Alderton's voice was careful, measured, doing exactly what his voice always did. But he was gripping the doorframe. He was extracted by a civilian team and spent 5 weeks in a field hospital with no communications access. He found out about Dax 4 days ago. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that added anything. Rourke cleared his throat. "I think," he said, "we can mark the behavioral assessment as conclusive." Nobody disagreed. Dax raised his head from Delray's shoulder and looked across the room at Elara. It was a brief look, specific, the kind that she documented in the program literature as secondary handler acknowledgement, a trained animal recognizing a secondary figure of safety in the presence of the primary. She had written the description of that behavior. She had never expected to be on the receiving end of it. And then Alderton's phone rang, and he answered it. And the expression that moved across his face was not good news and not bad news, but the particular quality of information that changed the shape of everything that came after his eyes going to Elara. His hand tightening on the phone, paused before he said, carefully, into the receiver, "Say that again." He listened. He looked at her. "Solano didn't leave the building at 11, he said. She went to the records room. The IG team found a shredder running. Concrete room felt very still." "What did she shred?" Elara asked. "They don't know yet. But they found a second set of intake documents hidden in a secondary file folder documents that hadn't been in the system, that weren't in the original transfer file. Handwritten notes." He paused, "with your name on them. Your real name, your program designation, and a date 6 weeks before you arrived at this hospital." The room held that. "Someone knew I was coming here," Elara said. "Yes." Alderton's voice was flat with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear. "Question is how, and whether you being here was the plan, or whether it was the thing someone was trying to prevent." Question landed in the room and nobody answered it, because nobody had an answer yet. And in the silence, Dax pressed harder against Delray's knee, and Delray kept his hand on the dog's neck, and the rest of the room did what rooms full of professionals did. When something exceeded their current framework, they got very still and very quiet and waited for someone to start making sense of it. Elara was the one who moved first. "The handwritten notes," she said to Alderton. "What exactly did they say?" "Rourke's team is photographing them now before processing. What they relayed to me was a name, your program designation, Specialist Voss, Fort Langdon, and a date. 6 weeks ago. And something that read like a preparation note. They described it as," he checked his phone screen, "arrival window, capability assessment, containment options." The words sat in the air. Containment options. She processed that without letting it show on her face, which was a skill she'd learned before she'd learned most other skills, and had never entirely stopped needing. Whoever had written those notes wasn't surprised when she appeared at Calloway Medical Center. They had anticipated it, and they had been thinking in advance about how to contain what she could do when she got here, which meant someone had known she would be assigned here weeks before the staffing agency made the call. "Who submitted the travel nurse request to the agency?" she asked. Alderton looked up from his phone. The question had arrived somewhere he hadn't gone yet. "Don't know, find out." She stood. "Because if Donner Group or Solano or whoever is behind this had advanced knowledge of my assignment, they either manipulated the staffing process to bring me here, or they intercepted an existing request and used it. Either way, there's a paper trail." Rourke, who had been quiet through this exchange, spoke. "Ms. Voss, at this point I need to ask you to stay available to us and to not." "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I'm going to sit in the hallway outside this room, and when your team has the photographed documents, I want to see them. Not because I'm entitled to, but because I may be able to read something in them that your team won't recognize without the program context." Rourke looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. Once, the way people nodded when they were conceding a point they'd been about to make themselves. She went out to the hallway. Delray found her there 11 minutes later. He was moving more carefully than he'd come in the long travel and the physical cost of it settling back into his frame, now that the immediate crisis of reunion had released some of its pressure. He sat against the wall beside her, which put him low enough that she had to adjust her angle to look at him directly. "You're the one who kept him alive," he said. "It wasn't a question. I wrote a report. Other people made the decisions." "That's not what Alderton told me." She didn't argue with it. "How long were you in the field hospital?" 5 weeks and 3 days. He looked at his left arm, the one that sat differently, a brief glance, the glance of someone who had cataloged a damage and was still getting used to the inventory. "Comms blackout for most of it. They told me about Dax when I was stable enough to use a phone. I was on a transport 18 hours later." He paused. "They told me he was scheduled for. He's not anymore." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "He wouldn't eat for 7 days. "I know. He does that when he thinks I'm not coming back. It happened once before, during a training accident, when I was in the hospital for 4 days. Stopped eating on day 2. He looked at his hands. "I didn't know he'd been sent here. I thought he was at the program facility in Virginia. Someone changed the routing." He looked at her. "Changed it. Transfer destination was altered in the intake documentation. He was supposed to go to the program facility for the mandatory recovery period. Instead, he ended up here, in a civilian medical center with no handler bond specialist, structured program contact, and an administration that didn't know what the mandatory recovery window meant." She kept her voice factual. "It was easier that way. Someone wanted him in a place where the evaluation would fail." Delray processed that without expression, the particular stillness of someone who had been trained to receive bad information without visible reaction. Then quietly, "Why?" "The Phantom Fang program is up for contract renewal. Donner Group holds the support contract. If the program's flagship K9 fails behavioral evaluation after a handler loss, it supports a narrative that the program's training methodology is flawed, the success rate is overstated, and the contract should be renegotiated or awarded to a different provider." She looked at the concrete wall across the narrow corridor. A dead dog is worth more to them than a rehabilitated one. The silence after that had weight. "Dax has 17 confirmed operational deployments," Delray said. His voice had gone flat in the way that wasn't absence of emotion, but its opposite. 2 Valor citations. He found an IED cache in Fallbrook province that saved 11 personnel. He stopped. "They were going to kill him to win a contract." "Yes." He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Tell me what you need from me." What she needed from him, it turned out, was a signature and a statement. Rourke's team had completed the photograph documentation of the handwritten notes by 7:15, and when they brought the images to the hallway on a tablet, Elara looked at them for 4 minutes in silence and identified 3 things that her program background could read that a general IG investigator could not. The first was the notation system. The abbreviations used in the notes, the way the writer had referenced behavioral protocols and assessment categories, were consistent with Phantom Fang internal documentation language, not the public-facing program materials, the internal documents, the ones that required security clearance. Whoever had written these notes had access that went beyond what an administrative coordinator at a regional medical center should have. The second was a reference she recognized from a different context entirely, a case number, formatted in the specific alphanumeric structure used by the program to classify assets. The number corresponded to Dax's file. She'd seen it in the transfer documentation. Presence in handwritten notes that had been hidden in a secondary folder meant whoever wrote them had accessed the classified asset registry. That wasn't a Donner Group employee doing contract administration. That was someone with program clearance. The third thing was the date in the upper corner of the second page. 8 weeks ago. 2 weeks before Delray's unit had deployed to the operation where he was reported KIA. She looked at Alderton. Someone knew about the operation. Took the tablet from her and looked at the date. She watched his face go through something careful and controlled and then arrive somewhere harder. Classified operational date. Yes. The operation that resulted in Delray being reported dead and Dax being transferred started 8 weeks ago by someone who knew the timeline in advance. She kept her voice low. "Alderton, the operation report. Was Delray's injury reported as a combat casualty or killed by hostile fire?" He was still looking at the tablet. "Standard field report. Nothing flagged. But he was extracted by a civilian team. Contractor extraction team." Which is he stopped. She let the silence do the work. "Which is consistent with a pre-planned extraction that was never reported up the chain as a rescue," he finished. "Which would be consistent with someone wanting the KIA report to stand so the program would initiate asset transfer." He set the tablet down. Someone staged this from the beginning. The operation, the KIA report, the transfer routing, all of it. The notes in that folder are proof that the staging was planned at least 8 weeks out. She looked at Rourke. That's not contract fraud. That's a coordinated operation against a classified military program using what appears to be internal program access. Rourke's expression had not changed significantly throughout this conversation, but the quality of his attention had shifted in the way of someone whose case had just expanded by several orders of magnitude. He looked at the other IG officer, who was already on a phone, speaking in the clipped shorthand of someone reporting to a superior who needed information in compact form. "I need your formal statement on the notation analysis," Rourke told Elara. "Documented, signed, with your program credentials on the record." "I know." She looked at Alderton. "Authorization? I'm authorizing you now." His voice was even. "My authority as program liaison extends to credential disclosure in the context of an active IG investigation. Consider this on the record." "Then yes," she said to Rourke. "I'll give you the full statement." Statement took 90 minutes. She sat at the folding table in the assessment room, while Rourke asked questions, and the recording device ran, and Klein sat in the corner, maintaining the careful fiction of being there for veterinary documentation reasons. Del Rey had taken Dax to the far end of the room, where the dog was finally eating a bowl that the overnight vet tech had brought down before she'd been informed the euthanasia order was suspended, apparently still completing her routine care tasks, with the dedication of someone who had decided the paperwork wasn't her problem. Elara answered every question without hedging. She disclosed her program designation, her role, the scope of her work from 2013 to 2017, and the circumstances of her departure, a circumstances agreement, following a disagreement with program leadership over the direction of handler bond protocols in the third phase of the program. She had believed the protocols were being compressed to reduce training time and increase deployment throughput. She had documented her concerns formally. The program had disagreed. She had been offered the circumstances agreement, which sealed her record and released her from her obligations, and she had accepted it because the alternative was fighting an institutional decision from inside an institution that had already made up its mind. She had spent 8 years as a travel nurse in civilian hospitals. She had never entirely stopped being the person who built the system that Dax was trained under. When she finished, Rourke looked at his notes for a moment. "The departure circumstances you described, was there any documentation of the disagreement filed within the program?" "A formal dissent report. I have a personal copy. We'll need that. I'll provide it." She folded her hands on the table. "Rourke, the person who wrote those notes had access to the classified asset registry and the operational timeline. It's a short list of people. And if they staged Del Rey's KIA report, they had contact with whoever processed that field report. That's military chain, not contractor chain." Rourke looked at her steadily. "We're aware of that implication. I want to make sure it's being followed." "It is." He closed his notebook. "Ms. Voss, I want to be direct with you. This investigation has expanded significantly from what we were initially briefed on. Scope now includes potential classified information compromise, potential falsification of military casualty records, and a coordinated action against a protected program. The Donner Group connection is the entry point, but it's not the ceiling." He paused. "Your documentation this morning, and your statement tonight, are central to everything that follows. I want you to understand what that means for your position here. It means I stop being a travel nurse at this hospital. It means you are formally a material witness in a DoD Inspector General investigation. Carries protections. It also carries obligations." She nodded. "I understand." "Good." He stood, which was the signal that the formal portion was ending. "We're going to need you available for follow-up. Don't travel outside Colorado without notifying us. We'll arrange a formal debrief with program oversight by the end of the week." She said she'd be available, and meant it. At 9:45 that evening, Brenna Solano was formally detained. Elara heard about it from Alderton, who heard about it from Rourke, and the information arrived in the kind of clean, factual sequence that IG proceedings moved in when they were running well. Solano had been located in the hospital parking structure, in her car, with her phone and a laptop. The laptop contained correspondence that the IG team had obtained a warrant for within the hour. Correspondence included communications with a Donner Group executive that detailed the plan for Dax's evaluation manipulation, the compressed timeline rationale, and references to the secondary document set that Solano had been in the records room attempting to destroy. She had not finished shredding. The incomplete destruction of the documents meant the IG team had both the originals and the shredded fragments, and the fragments could be reconstructed. Solano's legal team arrived at 10:20 and advised her not to speak, which was correct advice that came approximately 9 hours too late to change the evidentiary landscape. Merritt was formally notified of the investigation scope at 10:30. Elara was on the third floor, finishing the patient handoff notes that she'd postponed through the evening's events, when Darren appeared at the nursing station with the particular expression of someone who had been watching a slow-moving event reach its destination. Merritt resigned, Darren said, effective immediately. It just went out to department heads. She kept writing. When email came through 10 minutes ago, no explanation. Just administrative language about a transition of leadership and an interim appointment. He watched her. You knew this was coming. I thought something like it might. Elara. His voice dropped not for secrecy, but because the nursing station was a public space, and what he was about to say was not a public conversation. Are you okay? She stopped writing. It was an unexpected question, or maybe it wasn't unexpected, but she hadn't been prepared for the straightforwardness of it, the simple directness of someone asking about the person rather than the situation. I'm tired, she said, which was true and was also only part of it, and was all she had language for right now. Go home, he said. The floor is covered. Go home and sleep. She finished the note she was on. Then she gathered her things, said good night to Mrs. Albright, who was inexplicably still awake, and went to the parking lot and sat in her Subaru for a moment before starting it. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but she knew they were there. Cold was real. The heater would work about 60% of the time. She drove home. The next 3 days moved in the way of aftermath, not cleanly, not quickly, but with the specific grinding momentum of institutional processes that had been set in motion and were now working through their natural sequence without requiring her to push them. Rourke's team spent 2 full days in the hospital's administrative records. A forensic accountant was brought in from Denver to review the Donner Group contract documents, which revealed a billing structure that had been designed to generate performance benchmarks that depended on the Phantom Fang program's deployment numbers. Program delivering fewer operational K9s meant lower contract obligation. Program under scrutiny for dog behavior failures meant renegotiation leverage. The financial motive was cleaner and more documented than anything the IG team had initially expected, which meant the legal exposure was correspondingly larger. Solano's correspondence, once fully processed, revealed that she had been recruited by a Donner Group executive named Franklin Pryor 18 months earlier. Pryor had identified her through a previous contract position at a DoD-adjacent facility and had spent 3 months cultivating a working relationship before making a specific proposal access to intake documentation in exchange for a monthly payment routed through a consulting firm that existed primarily on paper. The documents Solano had hidden in the secondary folder were her own insurance policy. She had told the IG team in a limited statement before her legal counsel fully intervened. She had kept records of everything Pryor had told her to do, in her own handwriting, because she had not trusted him and had wanted leverage. The leverage had been found by the wrong people at the wrong time. But the records were comprehensive. Pryor was taken into federal custody on the second day. He made no statement. His legal team was expensive and efficient, and the proceedings that followed would take considerably longer than a week. But the evidentiary foundation that Rourke's team had built in those 48 hours was, by any professional measure, solid. The classified access question, who within the program had provided the asset registry number and the operational timeline that appeared in Solano's notes, was referred to a different division of the IG's office. Alderton told Elara this on the third morning over terrible coffee in the hospital's second-floor cafeteria, and he said it with the careful neutrality of someone who knew more than he was positioned to share and was choosing his words accordingly. It's above this facility's scope, he said. The division handling it has the clearances and the access logs. Do they have a lead? They have something. I'm not in a position to characterize it further. He looked at his coffee. What I can tell you is that the operational date in those notes was known to fewer than 30 people. That's a short list. Yes. And your name appearing in the notes, the preparation documentation, the arrival window that came from someone who knew both the operational timeline and your sealed service record. Those two things don't overlap in many places. She knew what he wasn't saying. She'd been thinking about it for 2 days. The intersection of classified operational data and her sealed personnel record pointed to someone inside the program, not Donner Group, not a contractor, but someone within the structure she'd spent 4 years building. Someone who had seen the file that documented her disagreement with program leadership. Someone who had decided that the person most qualified to catch the manipulation was also the person most worth containing. The circumstances agreement I signed, she said. when I left the program. Who had access to the full terms? Program leadership, general counsel, the officer who negotiated it. He looked at her. I'll get that list to the division handling the classified access question. Thank you. He nodded. His coffee was still terrible and he drank it anyway, which she found oddly humanizing. Klein found her that afternoon in the third-floor break room, which had become the unofficial meeting point for all conversations that needed to be semi-private without appearing to be deliberately hidden. The formal recommendation went through, Klein said. She was holding a printout, which she set on the table. Dax is cleared for program reinstatement. Delray's handler status has been formally reinstated. As well, the KKI designation has been corrected in the military record. They'll go through a 30-day structured reintegration at the program facility in Virginia. Standard protocol. Good. Elara looked at the printout. Is this the formal recommendation? Copy of it. Rourke's office sent it to me as the attending veterinary coordinator. Klein sat down. Your behavioral assessment is cited as the primary clinical basis for the reinstatement recommendation. By name. Elara read the relevant section, her name, her program designation, her assessment findings. In a document that would sit in the permanent record of the Phantom Fang program, accessible to everyone with the relevant clearance, permanently. The sealed record had been, in a sense, unsealed not in violation of the agreement, but through the authority of a .G proceeding, which superseded the circumstances, agreement's disclosure restrictions. Everything she had spent 8 years carrying quietly was now in a file that said clearly and permanently, this person built this person was right, and this person came back when it mattered. She folded the printout and put it in her pocket. What happens to your nursing assignment here? Klein asked. The agency will reassign me. This placement is effectively overgiven. She gestured at the general scope of everything that had happened in the last 4 days. Given everything, you could stay. We have a real need on the 3rd floor, and frankly the hospital is going to need some stability while the interim director figures out what they've inherited. Klein paused. Darren asked me to mention it. She looked at Klein. Darren asked you to mention it. He said asking you himself felt too much like pressure. Thoughtful that way. A beat. You don't have to decide now. I know. She looked at the window-gray sky. January, the mountains invisible again, but there. Klein. Was there anyone on this hospital's staff who knew before I got here who I was? Klein was quiet for a moment. I didn't. Merritt didn't. His reaction when you disclosed your credentials was genuine. I was watching him. She folded her hands on the table. If anyone on the clinical staff knew, I don't know who. Solano knew the preparation notes were hers. Yes. But you're asking if someone local brought you here intentionally. Someone on the care side. I'm asking if the staffing request that brought me to this hospital was filed by someone at Calloway. Klein's expression changed.
Not dramatically, a small shift.
The kind that happened when a question arrived from an unexpected direction and the recipient needed a second to orient. Staffing requests for travel nurses go through HR. Merritt's office approves the final selection, but the initial request is usually filed by the department head. Which department requested a travel nurse with trauma and surgical step-down experience? She stopped. I don't know. I'd assumed it was Joellen Pruitt, 3rd floor. She's been asking for additional staffing for months. Was it a pause? I can find out. Please do, Elara said. Klein left. Elara sat with her coffee in the gray window and the folded printout in her pocket and waited, because she'd been doing this long enough to know that the last piece was always the one that arrived when you'd stopped looking for it. It arrived in 22 minutes. Klein came back into the break room and sat down and had the expression of someone who had found something they didn't know what to do with. Staffing request, Klein said carefully. It came from the Veterinary Services Coordination Office. The room was quiet. My office, Klein said. It was filed from my office. Weeks ago. Under my administrative login. She looked at Elara with something that was not guilt but was in the same family. I didn't file it. No, Elara said. Someone with access to your login did. Elara Klein's voice had gone careful, and it was the careful of someone trying to say something precisely. Staffing request specified nursing credentials. Trauma experience. Fort Bragg adjacent hospital background. She paused. Specific enough that the agency would have had a very short list of candidates who matched. A list of one, Elara said. Probably. Klein looked at her. Someone used my credentials to request you specifically, which means someone wanted you here. Elara thought about Alderton's message on her first night. Someone who needs you to keep going. She thought about the months between leaving the program and arriving at Calloway, the assignments that had been, in retrospect, gradually orienting her toward this region. A hospital in Raleigh, a placement in Fort Collins. Smaller steps, each with a reason, each filed through the same agency. Alderton, she said. I need to talk to Alderton. But when she reached the hallway and called his number, it rang 6 times and went to voicemail. She tried again. Same result. She texted, "Did you file the staffing request?" No response. She texted Alderton. The request came from Klein's office under her credentials. Specified my background. Someone brought me here on purpose. Was it you? The dots appeared, stopped. Appeared again. Then his response came through, and it was not an answer. It was 3 words that rearranged everything she thought she knew about the last 6 weeks. It wasn't me. She stared at the screen. The dots appeared again. Elara. I just pulled the access log for the credentials used to file that staffing request. The login IP traces back to a terminal in the program's administrative offices in Virginia. And the user who authenticated the session A pause. A long pause, long enough that she'd started walking, moving without a direction, just moving. The user was your former program director, Colonel Anita Rawlings, the one who negotiated your circumstances agreement, the one who told you that your concerns about the protocols were overruled. Stopped walking, she filed the request. She brought you here. She knew what was happening to Dax, and she knew you were the only person who could stop it. And she did it without telling you, without warning you, without preparing you for any of it. The hallway around her continued its hospital business, a cart, a phone, footsteps, the ordinary sounds of a place that was still running while the ground shifted. I don't know if she's trying to help you or use you, Alderton wrote, but she wants to talk to you. She's been waiting. She asked me to tell you that when we reach this point. Elara read that last sentence twice. She's been waiting. 8 years. Elara had spent 8 years being the person who left, who signed the agreement, packed up the work she'd built, and walked away from it, and spent her time in other people's hospitals, doing good work that had nothing to do with who she'd been before. And Rawlings, the woman who had sat across a table from her in 2017 and told her calmly and firmly that the program had decided and that Elara's choices were compliance or departure, had apparently spent some portion of those 8 years watching, waiting. And when the moment came that required Elara specifically, she had moved pieces on a board that Elara hadn't known she was sitting on. Her phone buzzed one more time, a number she didn't recognize. Different from Alderton's. She answered it. Specialist Voss. The voice was older than she remembered it, but the cadence was identical, that particular rhythm of someone who spoke in complete sentences and chose every word the way a person chose tools. Precise. Never decorative. I imagine you have questions. Elara stood in the hallway of Calloway Medical Center on a January afternoon, with the mountains invisible outside, and said, with a steadiness that surprised even herself, "You have about 30 seconds to explain why I shouldn't hang up." Pause that was almost a breath. Almost, but not quite too controlled, even now. Because Colonel Anita Rawlings said there's a second program, not Phantom Fang. Something that used Phantom Fang as cover. And the people running it have been inside the program for 3 years. And the document you found tonight with your name on it is not the only document with your name on it. And the one you haven't found yet is the one that explains why they've wanted you contained since the day you filed your formal dissent report in 2017. Cart rolled past. The phone rang at the nursing station. Someone's footsteps went down the hall and around the corner and away. Elara did not hang up. "Start talking," Elara said. Rawlings did not ease into it. That had never been her style, and apparently 8 years had not changed it. She spoke in the same measured, direct cadence that Elara remembered from every program meeting, every formal review, every difficult conversation that had ever happened between them, the cadence of a person who had already organized the information and was now delivering it in the most efficient sequence. When you filed your dissent report in 2017, you documented specific concerns about the compression of handler bond protocols in the program's 3rd phase. You were correct. The compression was not an administrative efficiency decision. Designed. A pause not for effect but for precision. There was a secondary interest embedded in the program's oversight structure, not Donner Group, they came later. A group of defense analysts and senior procurement officers who had identified that the Phantom Fang K9 deployment model, if it could be shown to fail at scale, would create a procurement window for an alternative system they had financial stakes in. Drone-based detection technology. The argument was that trained animals were a liability. Too expensive, too unpredictable, too dependent on individual handler relationships. The handler bond protocol compression, Elara said slowly, made the dogs more likely to fail after handler loss. Exactly. You saw it in 2017 and documented it formally. That made you a problem. The circumstances agreement was designed to remove you cleanly. Your sealed record was designed to ensure you couldn't be credibly sourced if you ever tried to speak about what you'd seen. Elara leaned against the wall. The hallway continued around her. You negotiated that agreement. You're the one who sat across from me and told me to sign it. Yes. Rawlings's voice didn't change. Because I was not yet in a position to do anything else. I needed time, and you needed to be safe, and the only way to accomplish both was to get you out of the building with your license intact, and your record sealed against anything they might try later. A beat. I understand if that explanation doesn't satisfy you. It doesn't fully satisfy me either. She stood with that for a moment. 8 years of carrying the weight of a departure she'd never fully understood, of wondering whether she'd been right to push back or right to leave, of working in other people's hospitals with skills she couldn't fully use, and underneath all of it, the possibility that the woman who'd handed her the exit had been, in some complicated and imperfect way, trying to protect the exit. The second document, Elara said. The one with my name that I haven't found. What is it? A targeting assessment, filed internally 3 years ago by the procurement group. It identifies you as the individual most capable of exposing the protocol manipulation, and it recommends active monitoring of your professional movements and, if necessary, preemptive discrediting. Rawlings's voice was even. The word they used was preemptive. They had been watching you since 2019. When the DAX situation developed and the IG audit became a possibility, the targeting assessment was activated. Preparation notes Solano kept were part of that activation. They were going to discredit me. They were going to surface an incident from your military service, a patient outcome from 2016, a K9 that died during a field trial recovery that you supervised. The outcome was not your fault. The file was complete. They had prepared a version of the record that made it look like a negligence case, and they were going to file it with the licensing board if you became a credible threat to the evaluation outcome. False record. Alderton had mentioned it once briefly in a context she hadn't fully understood at the time. Sealed record. The buried incident. She hadn't known what it meant. Now she did. The 2016 file, she said. Is it still usable as a weapon? No. The IG team has the authentic record and the fabricated version. The fabricated version is now evidence in the federal proceeding against Pryor and his associates. Rawlings paused. Cannot be used against you. It can only be used against them. The weight of that settled through her in stages, each one taking a second to arrive. The thing she'd carried without fully knowing the shape of it, the vague awareness that something in her record could be used to undo her, the careful management of how much she disclosed, 8 years of keeping herself just small enough to be safe, that weight had a specific form now, and it had been picked up by someone else's hands, and it was gone. Sailed once. Long slow. Why didn't you tell me any of this before I arrived here, she said. 'Cause I couldn't. Rawlings's voice for the first time had something in it that was not quite regret but lived in that neighborhood. The monitoring was active. Any direct contact between us would have triggered it. I used Klein's administrative credentials through a secured relay because it was the only way to get you into that building without the procurement group knowing I was involved. They had known they would have moved the DAX timeline up by a week, and there would have been nothing left to save. So you moved me like a piece on a board. Yes, no qualification. No softening, I did. And I am telling you now, because you deserve to know all of it, not just the parts that make what I did look acceptable. A pause. What I did was necessary and also not entirely ethical, and I'm prepared to sit with both of those things being true at the same time. Elara didn't say anything for a long moment. The honest answer was that she didn't know yet how to fully process what she was hearing. The anger was real. The relief was real. Complicated recognition that the person who had maneuvered her was also the person who had believed enough in her capabilities to stake a covert operation on them. All of it was real simultaneously, and she was tired enough that sorting it cleanly was beyond her current capacity. What do you need from me now? She finally asked. Your formal statement about the protocol compression. What you observed in 2017. What you documented in the dissent report. What you've seen in Dax's case that corroborates the pattern. The IG has Pryor and Solano. The federal prosecution has the financial records. What they need to close the procurement group case is a subject matter expert who can testify to the deliberate design of the protocol failures. Rawlings's voice was steady. That's you. That has always been you. And I know I'm asking you to do something I pushed you out of the program for being willing to do. I'm aware of the irony. Elara closed her eyes for a second. Open them. Set up the meeting. Formal on the record with Rourke present. I'll have it arranged by tomorrow morning. Rawlings. She stopped. There was one more thing. the thing that had been sitting under everything else since Alderton's text. 2016 incident. The K9 that died. What was in the real file? Pause that had a different quality from the others. Calculating. Something gentler or as close to gentle as Rawlings's voice got. The real file says you spent 14 hours attempting to stabilize an animal that had injuries incompatible with survival, that you documented every intervention accurately, and that you submitted a full after-action report recommending changes to field trial medical protocols that were subsequently adopted. She paused. The file says you did everything right. It always said that. Elara stood in the hallway and let that be true. Tomorrow morning, she said. I'll be there. She hung up. The formal meeting happened the next day in a conference room on the first floor that Calloway's interim director, a quiet, competent woman named Sandra Okafor, who had been brought in from the Regional Health Authority and seemed to be approaching the situation with the pragmatic focus of someone handed a live situation and choosing, wisely, stay out of the parts of it that weren't hers, had made available to the IG team for the duration. Rawlings appeared in person. She was 61 now, and she looked like someone who had spent the years since 2017 doing difficult work in difficult conditions, not worn down, but condensed. The way people got when they'd been carrying something significant for a long time and had learned to carry it efficiently. She was in civilian clothes, which surprised Elara for a fraction of a second before it didn't. Rawlings had always understood that context was communication. They did not have a personal conversation first. There was no catching up, no acknowledgement of the 8 years beyond a brief, direct look that said more than words would have managed anyway. They sat at the table, Rourke and his team across from them, and Elara gave her statement. It took 3 hours. She was precise. She was specific. She presented the 2017 dissent report. From the personal copy she had kept scanned, formatted, the original documentation of everything she had seen and argued and been overruled about. She explained the protocol compression, the mathematical relationship between shorter handler bond integration and increased post-trauma failure rates, the projected outcome in a dog like Dax, who had formed an exceptionally strong primary bond and lost it under traumatic circumstances. She explained how the fabricated 2016 record had been designed, which specific alterations had been made to the authentic documentation, and how she knew because she had written the original file herself. Rawlings corroborated. She provided internal communications she had preserved from her own position inside the program documentation of the procurement group's access to program leadership, requests that had come through official channels but served unofficial interests, paper trail that was incomplete but coherent enough to establish the pattern. By the time they finished, Rourke's case had the spine it had been missing. Federal prosecutors are going to want both of you available for the proceeding, he said when the recording stopped. This is beyond the IG's formal scope now. We're referring to DOJ. I'm available, Elara said. Same, said Rawlings. Rourke gathered his materials. He looked at Elara for a moment before he stood the look of a professional who had learned something about a person over the course of a week and was recalibrating his initial assessment. Not dramatically, but genuinely. For what it's worth, he said, the dog would have been euthanized on day 20 if you hadn't been in that building. I know, she said. I mean that as more than a statement of fact. He picked up his notebook. It matters that you stayed when you had every reasonable basis to step back. She didn't have a clean response to that, so she nodded and he left. Institutional collapse of the people who had built this particular architecture of harm did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened the way most institutional collapses happened in stages, each one documented, each one filed, each one entering the permanent record with the quiet finality of a door closing. Franklin Pryor was indicted on 7 federal counts, including wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and misuse of classified information. His legal team was excellent, and it did not matter in any meaningful way, because the evidentiary record Rourke's team had built was the kind that excellent legal teams maneuvered around the edges of, rather than dismantled. Procurement Group 4 defense analysts and 2 senior procurement officers, people who had decided that the financial value of a drone contract was worth the deliberate engineering of a training program's failure, faced parallel proceedings that would take months to fully adjudicate, but would at every stage be visible in the public record. Brenna Solano negotiated a cooperation agreement in exchange for a reduced charge, testified fully. Her testimony filled in the gaps that the documentary evidence hadn't reached: the specific conversations with Pryor, the instructions she'd received, the access she'd been given to Klein's credentials through a procurement group contact who had, turned out, a prior relationship with a Calloway IT contractor. chain of access once pulled kept going. It went farther than anyone had initially estimated. Grayson Merritt was not charged with a crime. The investigation established that his role had been what Elara had assessed it to be in the first days: arrogance and institutional authority, weaponized by people who understood exactly how to work an administrator who prioritized his own position over the details of the situations under his management. He had not known what Solano was doing. He had known, however, that something was irregular about the DAC's intake timeline, and had chosen not to ask the questions that would have required him to take an action he found inconvenient. That wasn't a crime. It was a failure of the kind that left a mark on a professional record without putting a person in front of a federal judge. His resignation stood. He did not return to hospital administration. Elara had no particular feeling about that outcome, not satisfaction, not sympathy, just the neutral acknowledgement of a consequence that fit the action. The Phantom Fang program's mandatory recovery protocols were formally reinstated in their original form. Compressed version, the one that had been introduced in 2018 under the procurement group's influence and had quietly reshaped how dogs like Dax were handled after handler loss, was removed from the program documentation. The reinstatement order cited, by name and program designation, the original protocols developed by specialist E5 Elara Voss between 2013 and 2017. Alderton sent her a copy of the order. She read it at the kitchen table in her temporary apartment, on a Thursday evening, the heater doing its 60% working best, a bowl of soup going cold beside her because she'd been too focused to eat it. She read it twice. Then she set it down and ate the soup, which was still warm enough, and sat with the particular quiet of someone who had been told, in formal language, by the institution that had spent 8 years pretending she didn't exist, that she had been right. It was not the same as an apology. She was not waiting for one. The day before Dax and Delray left Calloway for the program facility in Virginia, Elara went downstairs one more time. Delray was there, sitting on the floor with Dax in a posture that had the ease of long familiarity, the dog draped partially across his legs, both of them existing in the particular comfort of two beings who had found each other again after genuinely believing they wouldn't. Delray's left arm was in a brace that the hospital's orthopedic unit had fitted him for 2 days earlier. He was doing the specific careful movements of someone reteaching their body the range of motion that injury had temporarily removed. He looked up when she came in. "Discharge paperwork's done," she said. "You're both cleared for transport." "I know," Alderton told me. He scratched Dax behind the ears without looking at his hand automatic, the gesture of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "I wanted to say something to you before we left. I can't figure out the right words." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He looked at her directly. He had the eyes of someone who had been in places that changed the color of what they saw, and he used them honestly. 7 days. He didn't eat for 7 days. And then you sat outside his kennel and waited, and that was I keep trying to put a word to it, and the word keeps being too small. She sat in the chair, the same chair, still in the same position, 7 feet from the kennel door. He knew what he was waiting for. I just made it safe enough for him to keep waiting. It's not a small thing. No, she agreed, it isn't. Dax lifted his head from Delray's knee and looked at her. The exhaustion she had seen in his eyes on the first night was gone, not replaced by something dramatic, not transformed into anything that looked like a movie moment, placed by the ordinary aliveness of an animal that had returned to its context, that knew where it was and who it was with and what the day held. Quiet. It was complete. "They told me what you are," Delray said. "What you built. The whole program basis. Former," she said. "What I was. Is there a difference in this case?" She thought about that. Not much of one. He nodded slowly. "He's going to be okay. You know that." "Yes. Are you?" The question landed with the same straightforward weight as Darren's the week before, the simple directness of someone who was asking about the person, rather than the professional, the human underneath the function. She'd been getting that question more in the last week than in the previous 8 years, and she still wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. "I think so," she said, which was more honest than yes and more accurate than "I don't know." Delray nodded, like that was the right answer. Maybe it was. When she left, Dax stood and followed her to the door, as far as the space allowed, and watched her go. She didn't look back. But she heard him, behind her, and the sound he made was the secondary recognition vocalization, the one she'd first heard on the night he'd opened his own kennel door, the one that the program literature described as an acknowledgement of a known figure of safety. Carried it up the stairs, and through the hospital, and out into the January air, and held it there, in the place where things that mattered were kept. Stayed. It was not a dramatic decision. It It was not made in a single moment of clarity, with the mountains visible and the light perfect. It was made over the course of several ordinary conversations with Darren, who said simply that the floor ran better with her on it. With Okafor, the interim director, who sat with her for 40 minutes and talked about what a rebuilt administration might prioritize and asked what Elara thought mattered and listened to the answer. Klein, who said nothing about it directly, but had started seeing her on veterinary services communications as though her continued presence was simply assumed. She called the staffing agency and released the temporary contract. She filed the paperwork for a direct employment application at Calloway Medical Center. It would take 6 weeks to process. She worked through those 6 weeks on the 3rd floor, doing the job that was in front of her Mrs. Albright's pillow, Mr. Ferris's blood pressure medication, the revolving patient population of a regional hospital in a Colorado January, each person arriving with their specific situation and leaving, if things went reasonably well, better than they came in. The formal deposition for the federal proceedings happened in February in a conference room in Denver with 2 prosecutors and a defense attorney who was very skilled and who could not find a flaw in her documentation because there wasn't one. Testified for 4 hours. She was precise, clear, and complete. She answered every question she was asked and did not answer questions she wasn't asked, which was a discipline that the defense attorney tested 3 different ways and did not successfully breach. Afterward, she ate a sandwich in the parking lot of the federal building because she hadn't eaten since 6 in the morning, and it was 2 in the afternoon, and the sandwich was mediocre, and the sun was out, and the mountains were visible from the parking lot in the way they sometimes were when the air was clear enough. Rawlings called her that evening. "You did well today," Rawlings said. "Told the truth in an organized way," Elara said. That's all it was. Most people can't manage that under that kind of pressure. "I know," she looked out her apartment window. Rawlings. The 2017 Dissent Report. The recommendations I made about the 3rd phase protocols. Are they going to be implemented? Not just restoring the original framework, but the improvements I recommended. A pause. The Program Oversight Committee is reviewing them. There is support for a full implementation. I've been advocating for it since the IG investigation made the internal politics more navigable. A beat. I want to ask you something. The protocol development work the refinements you've made to your own thinking in the last 8 years, based on clinical observation. I've read your nursing documentation. You've been applying behavioral principles to patient care in ways that are more sophisticated than most people in either field manage. I think you've been developing this whole time, even when you thought you'd put it down. Elara was quiet. There's a position, Rawlings said. Not inside the program. Adjacent to it. A consulting role, formally structured, that would allow you to continue nursing while contributing to canine behavioral protocol development on a contract basis. No service requirement. No circumstances agreement. No sealed records, full credit, full disclosure, your name on everything you contribute. She paused. It's not an apology. I'm not framing it as one. It's an offer that exists because you're the most qualified person to do the work. Elara sat with that for a long moment. Send me the formal terms, she said. I'll review them. I'll have them to you by Friday. Rawlings. She stopped. There was something she'd been wanting to say for 8 years that she'd never had the right moment for, and she wasn't sure this was exactly the right moment either. But she was done waiting for circumstances to be perfect before she said true things. It was right in 2017. A pause. Yes, Rawlings said. You were. I needed to hear that from you specifically. I know, her voice was even. You were right, the program was wrong. I was in a position where I had to manage that wrongness from inside, and my options were limited, and I made choices that cost you things they shouldn't have cost you. Another pause. I don't expect that to fully land tonight, but I wanted to say it on the record. It lands, Elara said. More than you might think. They said goodnight in the functional way of 2 people who were not friends exactly, but were no longer adversaries, and had arrived at something that was its own category. Kind of professional relationship that has been through enough real things to be permanently altered by them. In March, the IG investigation summary report was released in its public form. Classified elements were redacted. The publicly available version documented the coordinations between the procurement group and Donner group, the manipulation of the Phantom Fang intake protocols, the falsification of a military casualty report, and the attempted destruction of evidence at Calloway Medical Center. It named Pryor, named 3 of the 4 procurement group members who had been indicted, and described the role of a Calloway administrative coordinator in implementing the scheme at the facility level. It also cited, in the section on the investigation's resolution, a behavioral assessment filed by a clinical professional at Calloway Medical Center on the morning of January 14th. Described the assessment as the document that had initiated the formal IG response and provided the foundation for the emergency hold on the euthanasia order. Named her. Full name, program designation, current professional position. Darren brought a printout of the public report to the nursing station at 7 in the morning on a Thursday and set it on the counter without saying anything. She read the relevant section while her coffee cooled. "Mrs. Albright wants to know if you've been in the news," Darren said. "Tell her it's complicated. I told her that yesterday, and she said she prefers specifics." Elara looked at the printout. Then she looked up. Third floor was doing what the third floor did, moving, working, the ordinary, extraordinary business of people taking care of other people on the particular day when those other people needed it most. Monitors and carts, and the smell of antiseptic, and the sound of someone's family arriving, and the quiet of a room where rest was finally happening. "Tell her," Elara said, "that a dog is alive, and a man got his partner back, and the people who tried to prevent that are in a significant amount of legal trouble." Darren considered this. "She's going to have follow-up questions." "I know. Send her my way during her afternoon blood pressure check. I'll have time." He smiled the real kind, not the professional kind, and went back to his work. In April, Dax and Delray completed their 30-day reintegration at the program facility and were certified for return to operational deployment. Delray's arm had healed enough for modified active duty. The program's assessment classified Dax as operationally ready with full behavioral certification, the first Phantom Fang K9, to complete a successful handler reunification recovery under the restored original protocols. Alderton sent her the certification report with a single line. First one. "Because of you." She kept that email, she kept the IG report printout, kept the formal protocol reinstatement order and the consulting terms document that Rawlings had sent, which she had reviewed, negotiated 2 specific clauses of, and signed on the last day of March. She did not keep them because she needed proof. She kept them because they were the shape of something that had happened, and she had spent 8 years learning that the things that happened to you, the losses, the forced departures, the signed agreements, and the sealed records, became part of the material you built from, whether you chose that or not. She had not chosen to be the person who left the program in 2017. She had chosen every single thing that came after. On a Saturday in late April, she drove up into the mountains for the first time since arriving in Fenwick. Not to a destination, just up the way you drove up into altitude when you needed to see the space that was always there behind the ordinary foreground of obligation and logistics. Parked at a pull-off with a view that was embarrassingly beautiful, in the way that high country views sometimes were the kind that made the smallness of the individual feel clean rather than diminishing, because small and significant were not, it turned out, opposites. She sat on the hood of her Subaru with a coffee from a gas station 40 minutes back and looked at what was in front of her. She thought about Dax, who had waited without knowing for certain that there was anything left to wait for, who had held himself together in a bad room through sheer will, and the particular stubbornness of an animal whose loyalty was not conditional on the presence of its object, who had in the end been correct. The thing he was waiting for had come back, and the waiting had not destroyed him, and the damage was real but not permanent, and there was more work ahead. Thought about the 8 years she'd spent making herself smaller than she was, moving from hospital to hospital with one bag and skills she'd calibrated carefully to avoid disclosing too much of herself. She had told herself it was protection. Some of it had been. Some of it had been the habit of someone who had been told, in the formal language of a circumstances agreement, that the full version of herself was inconvenient to people who had the power to damage what she'd built. Nobody had that power anymore. She had used their own machinery to dismantle it, in a sub-level room at 2 in the morning, with a dog sleeping against her shoe, typing in the dark. That was not the ending she'd planned for herself when she left Fort Langdon in 2017 with a sealed file and a nursing license, and the particular emptiness of a person who has just been told that what they love is not what they're allowed to do. There had been no plan that ended here. In Colorado, with her name in a federal report and a consulting contract, and a permanent nursing position, and the mountains being their indifferent, necessary selves in front of her. She hadn't planned it. She had just stayed and worked and refused at every point where it was a genuine option to walk away from what was wrong. The thing about being underestimated is that it requires someone else's assessment of you to be accurate. It requires you to accept their version of what you're capable of as a fact about who you are rather than a statement about their limitations. For 8 years she had been careful enough and quiet enough that her real capacity existed mostly below the surface, and there was a kind of safety in that, and there was also a cost, and the cost had finally become larger than the safety was worth. She was done making herself into the size of other people's comfort. Coffee was terrible. The mountains were spectacular. She sat there until the light started to change, which took longer than she expected, because mountain light always did, and then she drove back down into Fenwick, and to the hospital where Mrs. Albright was waiting for specifics, and Mr. Ferrets needed someone to remind him about his medication, and there was work on the 3rd floor that was hers, and that she was, without qualification, exactly equipped to do. She walked in through the front entrance, badge clipped to her scrubs, the Colorado cold still in her hair, and nodded to the woman at the front desk, who had learned her name in the first week, and used it now the way people used the names of people who were expected to be there. "Dr. Klein left something for you," the desk attendant said. "The nursing station." It was a small envelope. Inside was a photograph, the kind printed from a phone, slightly grainy, informal. Dax and Delray in an outdoor space, somewhere that looked like a training facility. It was in motion, mid-stride, ears forward, doing the thing he was built to do in the context he was built to do it in. Delray was slightly out of frame, one hand visible at the edge, and the geometry of the image made it clear he was running alongside him. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting she didn't recognize and assumed was Delray's, he still recognizes the signals. All of them. She put the photograph in her chest pocket against the left side and went to work. The people who had tried to erase her had files with federal prosecutors. The dog everyone had decided was beyond saving was operational and alive. The man everyone had reported dead was running in a field somewhere with his partner, and the partnership was intact. And that specific form of damage had not been permanent either. And Elara Voss, the nurse who had driven into Fenwick, Colorado in a cracked bumper Subaru with a duffel bag and 3 days of clothes, the woman who had once built a system the military staked its K-9 program on, and had then been quietly moved offstage before anyone could ask her too many questions, was still here, with her name on documents that couldn't be sealed, doing work that couldn't be minimized, exactly as qualified as she had always been. It had taken a dog to bring her back. She didn't think that was a small thing.